The dealer's pitch lasted 45 minutes, spread across Mike Sullivan's cluttered desk in the cramped office at the back of Sullivan Farm Equipment in Independence, Iowa. Financial projections, tax write-off calculations, productivity analyses. Mike had rehearsed this pitch 100 times, perfected it on dozens of farmers. It usually worked, but Leonard Hartman's answer, when it finally came, took exactly 5 seconds. No. Just that. One word. Flat. Final. It was October 15th, 1974, a cold Tuesday afternoon, and Leonard was sitting in the worn leather chair across from Mike's desk, his cap in his lap, his work boots leaving small clumps of dried mud on Mike's carpet. He'd driven 23 miles from his farm near Jessup to look at a new tractor Mike had been calling him about for 3 weeks. A 1975 International Harvester 1066, bright red, 125 horsepower, all the modern features. Mike had the financing papers spread across his desk, an offer from International Harvester Credit that Mike genuinely believed was the opportunity of a lifetime. Interest rates were reasonable at 8.25%. Terms were flexible. The tax benefits were substantial. "Leonard, listen to me," Mike said, leaning forward with the earnest intensity of a man who believed what he was selling. "You can finance that 1066 we looked at for $14,800. Down payment of $2,000. Finance the rest. Your monthly payment would be $287 for 7 years. That's nothing, Leonard. That's 2 loads of corn. You're grossing what? 45,000 a year on your 320 acres. You can afford this easily." Mike slid the papers closer. "And think about the productivity gains. That 1066 has 125 horsepower. Your old M has what, 36? You could cut your field time in half, plant faster, harvest faster, handle bigger implements. You'd make up the payment in saved time and increased efficiency." Leonard was 46 years old, had been farming since he came home from the army in 1949, 25 years of working land. He looked at the papers on Mike's desk, at the shiny color brochure showing the International Harvester 1066 in all its red glory, cabin closed, power steering, modern hydraulics, everything a farmer could want in 1974. Then he looked at Mike. "I still owe $38,000 on my land. Got 9 years left on that note. Payments $500 a month. I'm not taking on equipment debt while I still have land debt. Can't do it." Mike sat back in his chair, exhaled slowly. This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. Leonard had been coming to Sullivan Farm Equipment for parts and service for 15 years, ever since he'd bought his 320 acres in 1965. Every year, like clockwork, Mike tried to sell him a new tractor. Every year, Leonard said no. "Leonard, that's stubborn thinking. That's Depression-era thinking. Your dad's generation, they were scared of debt because of what happened in the 30s. I understand that, I really do. But Leonard, this is 1974, not 1934. Things are different now. The economy's stable, crop prices are good, land values are going up. Debt isn't something to be afraid of anymore. It's a tool. You use it strategically to grow your operation." Mike was 42, had taken over Sullivan Farm Equipment from his father in 1969. He'd grown up in the business, understood farming, but he also understood modern finance. He believed in leveraged growth, in using credit to expand. That's what successful farmers did in 1974. "Debt is risk," Leonard said quietly. His voice was even, not defensive, just stating a fact as he saw it. "And I've got all the risk I can handle with that land note. Don't want more." Mike tried another angle, one he'd used successfully on other hesitant farmers. "What are you farming with now? That M you bought used, 20 years ago?" 23, 1951. Farmel M bought it in 1951 from a farmer near Waterloo. Paid $1,150 cash. Runs fine. Mike almost laughed. "Leonard, that tractor is 23 years old. 23 years. It doesn't have a cab, doesn't have power steering, doesn't have modern hydraulics or a synchronized transmission. No rollover protection. You're sitting out in the weather 12 hours a day. You're competing against farmers who have equipment from this decade, equipment that can do twice the work in half the time. He leaned forward again. How long you think you can keep that up? You're 46 now. Think you'll still want to be sitting on an open tractor when you're 56? 66! Leonard stood, picked up his cap. As long as it takes to pay off my land. Then we'll see about equipment. You're stubborn, Mike said, frustration creeping into his voice. That's what you are, just plain stubborn. You're leaving money on the table. You could be farming more efficiently, making more profit, building equity faster, but you won't because you're stubborn. Leonard smiled slightly, not offended. He'd been called worse. Maybe so, but I sleep at night, Mike. Can't put a price on that. He walked out. Mike watched through his office window as Leonard climbed into his 1967 Ford F-100 pickup and drove away. Mike shook his head, made a note in Leonard's file. Refused financing again. Won't buy new, stubborn. Then he turned his attention to his next appointment, a younger farmer who was ready to finance a new 1466. Leonard had bought his 320 acres in Buchanan County in January of 1965 for $265 per acre, total purchase price, $84,800. It was good land, black soil, flat, well-drained. The previous owner had died and his widow was selling to move to town. Leonard had $17,000 saved, money accumulated over 16 years of working as a mechanic at the Case dealership in Waterloo while farming rented ground on the side. He put that down and financed the remaining $67,800 through Buchanan County Savings Bank at 6.5% interest over 20 years. His monthly payment was $508.27, which Leonard always thought of as $508. Every month on the first, that $508 had to go to the bank. No exceptions, no delays. The land payment came before everything else. That payment consumed Leonard's thoughts in a way that people who've never farmed with debt might not understand. It was always there, always in the back of his mind. When he woke up in the morning, when he was working in the field, when he was lying in bed at night, $508 every month for 20 years. That was $121,168 total he'd pay for land that cost $84,800. The bank share was $3,768. His wife, Ruth, understood the weight of it. Her father, Raymond Kowalski, had lost a farm near Dysart in 1933. Lost it to a bank foreclosure when he couldn't make payments after crop prices collapsed. Ruth had been 4 years old when they'd lost the farm. She remembered fragments, her mother crying. Strangers walking through their house, looking at furniture, moving to a rented house in town that smelled like mildew and had no yard. She'd grown up poor in town, watching her father work factory jobs he hated, watching the defeat in his eyes every time he drove past farmland. She'd married Leonard Hartman in 1950, knowing he wanted to farm, knowing he'd saved money to buy land someday. But she'd made him promise one thing before she said yes: never more debt than you can handle. Never risk what happened to her father. $508 a month on the land was all they could handle. Leonard had calculated it carefully, conservatively, assuming bad years. In an average year, farming 320 acres of corn and soybeans, he could expect to gross $45,000. After seed costs, fertilizer, fuel, equipment repairs, insurance, property taxes, and basic living expenses for the family, he'd net somewhere around $15,000 to $18,000 in profit. The land payment of $6,096 per year consumed about 40% of that profit. It was tight, very tight, but manageable if they were careful. They didn't take vacations, didn't eat out. Ruth sewed clothes for the kids. They bought groceries on sale, heated with wood. Leonard cut himself, drove vehicles until they literally wouldn't run anymore. If Leonard added a tractor payment of $287 per month, that would be another $3,144 per year. Total debt service would jump to $9,540 annually, which would be almost 65% of his profit in an average year. That left almost no margin for error. One bad crop year, one major equipment breakdown, one unexpected expense, and they'd be in trouble, real trouble. So Leonard kept farming with his 1951 Farmall M. The tractor was old, visibly worn, slower than modern equipment, uncomfortable. No cab meant sitting in summer heat and spring rain and fall cold. No power steering meant fighting the wheel all day. The seat was a metal pan that Leonard had padded with an old tractor tire tube covered in canvas. The engine was loud enough that Leonard's hearing was permanently damaged. But the tractor was paid for. It ran. And every dollar Leonard didn't spend on a tractor payment was a dollar that could go toward paying off the land faster. In 1975, Leonard started making extra payments on his land note. The bank payment book said $508 per month, but Leonard started paying $700 whenever he could. That extra $192 accumulated over a year was $2,304 in additional principal. Over time, that would cut years off the loan and save thousands in interest. In 1976, he did it again, even more aggressively. The farm had a good year, corn prices were decent, and Leonard paid $800 per month toward the land. Some months, if he'd just sold beans or had a particularly good harvest, he'd pay $1,000. Every extra dollar went straight to principal. Ruth kept the payment records in a ledger at the kitchen table, wrote down every payment, calculated the remaining balance, figured out how many months they'd shaved off the original 20-year term. By December 1976, they'd cut the payoff date from January 1985 to September 1982, 2 years and 4 months ahead of schedule. Mike Sullivan, the dealer who'd called Leonard stubborn, sold 3 new tractors in 1974, 4 in 1975, 6 in 1976. Business was booming. Farmers were buying equipment, expanding operations, adding land, convinced the good times would last forever. The dealership expanded its showroom, hired another mechanic, ordered more inventory. Leonard bought parts for his old Farmall M and kept farming. New tie rod ends, $23. Rebuilt carburetor kit, $31. Oil filters and fluids, $18. His total equipment expenses for 1976 were $847. Farmers with new tractors were paying $3,000, $4,000 per year in equipment payments alone. By 1979, through disciplined extra payments, Leonard had reduced his land balance to $21,000. The original payoff date had been January 1985, but at his current pace, he'd have it paid off by mid-1981, almost 4 years early. His monthly payment was still officially $508, but he'd been paying $800 or so and $200 most months, attacking the principal aggressively. Then 1980 arrived, and everything changed. Interest rates spiked to combat inflation. The Federal Reserve pushed rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The grain embargo devastated exports. Corn prices fell from $3.20 to $2.40. Land values stopped climbing and started falling. Farmers who'd bought equipment in the mid-70s, who'd expanded on credit, who'd borrowed against rising land values, suddenly found themselves squeezed. Their debt hadn't changed, but their income had been cut in half. Their collateral was evaporating. By 1982, the full crisis was underway. Foreclosures accelerated. Every week the newspaper had more auction notices. Farms that had been in families for generations were being sold by banks. Equipment dealerships that had thrived during the boom were closing. Sullivan Farm Equipment sales dropped 80% from 1979 to 1982. Mike Sullivan laid off his second mechanic in early 1982, stopped ordering new inventory. By mid-1982, he was just trying to stay open, hoping the crisis would pass. Leonard kept farming with his 1951 Farmall M, now 31 years old. The tractor had outlasted dozens of newer machines, outlasted some of the farmers who'd bought those machines. Leonard maintained it meticulously, knew every bolt, every gasket, every sound it made. And he kept making payments on his land. Even when corn hit $2.10 and he cleared almost nothing, the land payment still went to the bank. $508 every month, sometimes more when he could manage it. The balance dropped. $18,000, then $15,000, then $2,400. On March 11, 1983, Leonard walked into Buchanan County Savings Bank with a check for $12,400. The final payment. The bank officer, a woman named Patricia Meyer, who'd been watching Leonard's discipline for 18 years, processed the payment and handed him the satisfaction document. The loan was paid in full. The farm was his, free and clear. He'd bought the land in January 1965 for $84,800, financed $67,800 at 6.5% over 20 years. Through aggressive extra payments, he'd paid it off in 18 years and 2 months. The bank had gotten $30,627 in interest instead of the $37,668 they would have received if he'd stuck to the minimum payments. Leonard had saved $6,541. More importantly, he owned 320 acres outright. In March of 1983, in the middle of the worst farm crisis since the Depression, while his neighbors were losing farms to foreclosure, Leonard Hartman had zero debt. That same month, Sullivan Farm Equipment closed permanently. Mike Sullivan, who'd built a thriving business during the boom years, couldn't survive the bust. The dealership his father had started in 1947, that Mike had taken over in 1969, was finished. Mike ended up taking a job at the John Deere assembly plant in Waterloo, an hour commute each way, building tractors instead of selling them. Leonard farmed his paid-off land through the worst years of the crisis. 1983, 1984, 1985, when prices were terrible and half his neighbors were failing. He survived because he had no debt eating his income. When corn was $2.10, he lost money on production costs. But he didn't have a $508 land payment anymore, didn't have a $287 tractor payment. He could survive $2.10 corn because he didn't owe anyone anything. In 1987, Leonard finally bought a different tractor. Not new, never new, a used 1976 International 1086 from an estate auction. The farmer had died. The widow was selling everything. Leonard bid $8,400, won it, paid cash. The tractor was 11 years old, had 4,800 hours, ran well. The 1951 Farmall M, after 36 years of faithful service, earned retirement. Leonard couldn't bring himself to sell it. Too much history, too much meaning. He parked it in the machine shed, kept it greased and covered, started it up once a year just to hear it run. Leonard farmed through the recovery years of the late 80s and all through the 90s. Prices improved. Land values started climbing again. Farmers who'd survived the crisis were buying land from banks at reduced prices. Leonard considered expanding but decided against it. 320 acres was enough. He was getting older, didn't need the stress of more ground. In 2001, at age 73, Leonard retired. He sold his 320 acres to a younger farmer for $2,000 per acre. Total sale, $672,000. The land he'd bought for $84,800 in 1965, struggled to pay off by 1983, was now worth almost 8 times what he'd paid. After taxes and settling his affairs, Leonard netted about $570,000 from the sale, plus he had substantial savings accumulated over decades of debt-free farming. He and Ruth bought a modest house in Independence, lived comfortably on the farm sale proceeds and Social Security. Leonard died in March of 2016 at age 88. Ruth had passed 2 years earlier. At Leonard's funeral, his oldest son James, who'd never farmed but had watched his father's philosophy play out over 50 years, gave part of the eulogy. "Dad was called a lot of things over the years. James said to the crowded church. Cheap, old-fashioned, behind the times. The word the farm equipment dealer used was stubborn. Said Dad was stubborn for refusing to buy new equipment on credit. James paused. And you know what? Dad was stubborn. Absolutely stubborn. He had a goal, which was to own his land free and clear, and nothing was going to get in the way of that goal. Not peer pressure from neighbors with new equipment, not sales pitches from dealers, not the temptation to look more successful than he was. Nothing. He looked at the crowd. That stubbornness kept us farming. When the crisis hit in the early 80s and half the farms in this county went under, we survived. Not because we were better farmers or smarter or luckier. Because we owned our land. No bank could take what we owned. James told the story of the 1951 Farmall M, the tractor Leonard had farmed with for 36 years while everyone else upgraded. That tractor is still in the shed on the farm. The new owner kept it as part of the sale. It still runs. Dad started it up every year until he couldn't physically do it anymore. It was a symbol to him. A symbol of choosing ownership over appearance, of choosing security over status. After the funeral, some of Leonard's old neighbors gathered at the farm one last time. The new owner, a man named Derek Paulson, who'd bought the place in 2001, had maintained Leonard's old machine shed. The 1951 Farmall M was still there, cleaned up, preserved. One of the old neighbors, a man named Vernon Schmidt, who was 81 and had survived the crisis through similar conservatism, looked at the old tractor and said, I remember in the 70s thinking Leonard was foolish. Everyone was buying new equipment. Everyone was expanding. Leonard just kept farming with this old M, kept making extra payments on his land. We thought he didn't understand modern agriculture. Vernon laughed bitterly. We were the ones who didn't understand. We didn't understand that land you own is worth more than land you owe on. We didn't understand that an old tractor that's paid for will outlast a new tractor that isn't. Leonard understood. We had to learn the hard way. Another farmer, younger, maybe 60, said, Same thing's happening now. Farmers buying $500,000 combines, $400,000 tractors, all financed. Everyone says you have to or you can't compete. Same thing they said in 1974. And it's probably wrong again, Vernon said. The crisis will come, always does. And when it comes, the farmers who own their equipment will survive. The farmers who owe will struggle. James Hartman, listening to this conversation, thought about his father's stubbornness, about the dealer who'd called Leonard stubborn for refusing credit, about how that stubbornness had looked like foolishness in 1974, but looked like wisdom in 1983, and looked like genius in 2016. The dealer called Leonard Hartman stubborn for refusing credit in 1974. Mike Sullivan had meant it as criticism, as a judgment of Leonard's backwards thinking. But Leonard took that stubborn refusal and turned it into survival. Kept his old Farmall M, paid off his land 2 years early, farmed debt-free through the crisis that killed half his neighbors' operations. The dealer's business went bankrupt in 1983. Leonard farmed until 2001 and sold his land for $672,000. Stubborn won, credit lost. And that old 1951 Farmall M, the tractor everyone said Leonard should have replaced, still sits in the shed where Leonard parked it in 1987, still starts, still runs. A monument to the idea that sometimes the stubborn choice is the right choice, that sometimes refusing what everyone else is doing is exactly what saves you. Mike Sullivan died in 2009 at age 77, worked at the John Deere plant until he was 70, never farmed again, never sold equipment again. Leonard Hartman farmed for 52 years, retired wealthy, lived comfortably until 88. The man who called him stubborn lost. The stubborn man won. That's the whole story. E.O.F. Leonard farmed his paid-off land through the worst years of the crisis. 1983, 1984, 1985, when prices were terrible and half his neighbors were failing. He survived because he had no debt eating his income. When corn was $2.10, he lost money on production costs. But he didn't have a $508 land payment anymore, didn't have a $287 tractor payment. He could survive $2.10 corn because he didn't owe anyone anything. His neighbors who'd financed heavily couldn't survive. They'd made the same crops Leonard made, worked just as hard, were just as skilled, but they had payments that consumed 60, 70, 80% of their income. At $2.10 corn, the math didn't work. They lost everything. In 1987, Leonard finally bought a different tractor. Not new, never new. A used 1976 International 1086 from an estate auction in Jessup. The farmer, a man Leonard had known for 30 years, had died of a heart attack. The widow was selling everything to move to town. Leonard bid $8,400, won it, paid cash from the checking account. The tractor was 11 years old, had 4,800 hours on it, ran well, needed some hydraulic work, which Leonard did himself over 2 weekends. The 1951 Farmall M, after 36 years of faithful service, earned retirement. Leonard couldn't bring himself to sell it. Too much history, too much meaning. That tractor represented every choice he'd made, every sacrifice, every time he'd said no to something easier. He parked it in the machine shed, drained the fluids, greased everything, covered it with a tarp, started it up once a year in the spring, just to hear it run. Leonard farmed through the recovery years of the late 80s and all through the 90s. Prices improved gradually. Land values started climbing again, though they wouldn't reach 1979 levels until the mid-2000s. Farmers who'd survived the crisis were cautiously buying land from banks at reduced prices. Leonard considered expanding. Banks were practically giving away foreclosed land in 1987-1990. He could have bought another 160, 320 acres easily, had the cash, had the equipment, but he decided against it. 320 acres was enough. He was 59 in 1987, getting older, didn't need the stress of more ground. Ruth agreed. They were comfortable. Why push it? In 2001, at age 73, Leonard retired. He'd been farming for 52 years, since 1949. His back hurt, his knees hurt, his hearing was shot from decades on open tractors. It was time. He sold his 320 acres to a younger farmer named Derek Paulson for $2,100 per acre. Total sale, $672,000. The land he'd bought for $4,800 in 1965, struggled to pay off by 1983, was now worth almost 8 times what he'd paid. After capital gains taxes and settling his affairs, Leonard netted about $570,000 from the sale. Combined with the savings he'd accumulated over decades of debt-free farming, he and Ruth were financially set. They bought a modest house in Independence, 1,400 square feet, 2 bedrooms, for $87,000 cash. Lived comfortably on Social Security and investment income from the farm sale. Traveled to places they'd never had time to visit while farming. Saw grandkids grow up, lived quietly. Ruth died in October 2014 at age 86. Leonard followed 16 months later, March 2016, at age 88. At Leonard's funeral, the church in Independence was packed. Over 300 people, testimony to a life lived with integrity. His oldest son, James, who'd never farmed but had watched his father's philosophy play out over 50 years, gave part of the eulogy. "Dad was called a lot of things over the years," James said to the crowded church. "Cheap, old-fashioned, behind the times, too conservative." The word the farm equipment dealer used in 1974 was stubborn. Mike Sullivan said Dad was stubborn for refusing to buy new equipment on credit. James paused, letting that sink in. And you know what? Dad was stubborn. Absolutely stubborn. He had a goal, which was to own his land free and clear, and nothing was going to get in the way of that goal. Not peer pressure from neighbors with shiny new tractors, not sales pitches from dealers who made it sound so easy. Not the temptation to look more successful than he was. Nothing. He looked at the crowd. That stubbornness kept us farming. When the crisis hit in the early 80s and half the farms in this county went under, we survived. Not because we were better farmers or smarter or luckier. We survived because we owned our land. No bank could take what we owned. And we owned it because Dad was too stubborn to take on debt he didn't absolutely need. James told the story of the 1951 Farmall M, the tractor Leonard had farmed with for 36 years, while everyone else upgraded every 5 or 7 years. That tractor is still on the farm. Derek Paulson kept it as part of the sale in 2001, maintains it, starts it up occasionally. Dad went out there a few times after he retired, just to see it, to sit on it one more time. It was a symbol to him, a symbol of choosing ownership over appearance, security over status, substance over show. After the funeral, some of Leonard's old neighbors gathered at the farm one last time. Derek Paulson, the current owner, had invited them. The 1951 Farmall M was still there in the machine shed, cleaned up, preserved, a museum piece now. Vernon Schmidt, 81 years old, one of the few who'd survived the crisis through similar conservatism, looked at the old tractor and smiled sadly. I remember in the mid-70s thinking Leonard was foolish. Everyone was buying new equipment. Modern tractors with cabs. Everyone was expanding, taking on debt, convinced prices would keep going up. Leonard just kept farming with this old M, kept making extra payments on his land. We thought he didn't understand modern agriculture. Vernon's voice got quiet. We were the ones who didn't understand. We didn't understand that land you own is worth infinitely more than land you owe on. We didn't understand that an old tractor that's paid for will outlast a new tractor that isn't. Leonard understood from day one. Some of us had to learn the hard way. Some of us didn't survive learning it. Another farmer spoke up, younger, maybe 60. It's happening again now. Different scale, bigger numbers, but same pattern. Farmers buying $500,000 combines, $400,000 tractors, $300,000 planters, all financed. Everyone says you have to or you can't compete. Exact same thing they said in 1974. And it's probably wrong again, Vernon said. The crisis will come. Always does eventually. Could be 5 years, could be 15, but it'll come. And when it does, the farmers who own their equipment outright will survive. The farmers who owe will be in trouble. The dealer called Leonard Hartman stubborn for refusing credit in October 1974. Mike Sullivan had meant it as criticism, as a judgment of Leonard's backwards thinking, his refusal to embrace modern finance. But Leonard took that stubborn refusal and turned it into survival. Kept his old Farmall M for 36 years, paid off his land 2 years early, farmed debt-free through the crisis that killed 14% of Buchanan County's farms. Mike Sullivan's business went bankrupt in October 1982. Mike worked at the John Deere plant until he was 70, never farmed again, never sold equipment again, died in 2009 at 77. Leonard Hartman farmed for 52 years, retired with $570,000 from his land sale, plus substantial savings, lived comfortably until 88. Stubborn won, credit lost. That's the whole story.